Not all heroes wear capes, and some of them go unnoticed until the moment they're needed most. You won't believe how this story turns out. But first, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to know. Let's begin. James sat quietly on a worn bench in the corner of the city park, watching as people passed by. The cool breeze ruffled his tattered coat, but he didn't mind it. He had grown used to the cold, the loneliness, and the feeling of being invisible. Every day was the same. He would wake up in his makeshift shelter behind a dumpster, scrounge for food, and sit in the park to watch the world move around him. His eyes followed a young couple walking hand in hand, their laughter carrying on the wind. A pang of longing twisted in his chest. James once had a life like that. He wasn't always homeless. He wasn't always someone people ignored or avoided. There was a time when he had a job, a family, and a home to call his own. He even had dreams, big dreams of making a difference. But those days felt like they belonged to someone else now, someone he barely remembered. James sighed and leaned back on the bench, staring up at the sky. The clouds drifted lazily, unconcerned with the troubles of the world below. He often found himself lost in thought, remembering the days when his life was different. He had worked in an office, wearing a suit and tie, feeling like he belonged. He had a family, people who cared about him. But all of that was gone now, lost in a series of bad choices and unfortunate events that spiraled out of his control. He didn't talk about it. There was no point. No one wanted to hear the story of a man who had fallen from grace. And even if they did, what good would it do? It wouldn't change his situation. He was still alone, with nothing but the memories of what once was. James sat on his usual bench, the afternoon sun casting a golden hue over the park. It was a day like any other. People walked by without a glance in his direction, completely unaware of his presence. His mind wandered, lost in thoughts of the past, when suddenly, a sharp cry shattered the calm. "Leave me alone," a voice yelled, trembling with fear. James looked up and saw a group of boys gathered in a circle, surrounding a much smaller boy. The little boy's face was streaked with tears, and he was trying to back away, but the older boys wouldn't let him. They shoved him, laughing as he stumbled. James's heart began to pound in his chest. The scene felt too familiar. He had seen this kind of cruelty before, long ago. His hands gripped the edge of the bench tightly as he watched, his body frozen with uncertainty. Should he step in? What would people think? A homeless man getting involved might cause trouble, and he feared they might accuse him of something worse. The bullies pushed the boy again, harder this time, sending him tumbling to the ground. "What are you gonna do? Cry for your mommy?" One of the older boys mocked, while the others laughed cruelly. The small boy's sobs grew louder as he struggled to get back on his feet, only to be shoved down again. His tiny hands reached out, trying to protect himself, but the boys circled him like predators, enjoying his helplessness. James's heart raced faster, and his stomach twisted in knots. He wanted to help, but fear held him back. He wasn't like other people. He had no status, no voice, no one who would believe him. What if the bullies turned on him? What if others saw him, judged him, and thought he was up to no good? But as he watched the little boy's tears fall, something stirred deep inside him. The fire that had flickered faintly in his chest for so long now burned brighter. He couldn't just sit there and do nothing. His own fears seemed small compared to the pain the boy was going through. With a deep breath, James stood up, his legs shaky beneath him. His throat was tight, and his hands trembled, but he knew what he had to do. He couldn't let this continue. No one else seemed to care, but he did. He had to. "Hey," James shouted, his voice louder than he expected. "Leave him alone." The bullies paused, their laughter fading as they turned to see who had spoken. Their eyes fell on James, and for a moment, they looked confused. Then one of the older boys sneered. "Who are you?" He jeered, looking James up and down. "You gonna save him, homeless man?" James swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their mocking stares, but he stood his ground. I said, leave him alone. He repeated, his voice steady now. He took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest, but he didn't back down. The bullies exchanged glances, clearly surprised that someone like James was standing up to them. For a moment, James thought they might laugh at him, but instead, they just glared. One of the boys gave the small boy a final shove before turning to walk away. Whatever, man, the leader muttered. Let's go. One by one, the bullies drifted away, throwing dirty looks over their shoulders as they left. James stood there, watching them go, his heart still racing but his resolve firm. As the last boy disappeared around the corner, James turned his attention to the small boy still sitting on the ground. His face was tear-streaked, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. James knelt down, offering him a hand. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Liam hesitated for a moment, his big, scared eyes looking up at James with a mixture of awe and confusion. He hadn't expected anyone to come to his rescue, especially not someone who looked like James. But now, as he gazed at the man who had just stood up for him, he felt a strange sense of gratitude. Slowly, Liam took James's hand and let him pull him to his feet. He brushed the dirt off his clothes, still shaking slightly, but the fear in his eyes was starting to fade. "Thank you," Liam whispered, his voice trembling but sincere. "Thank you for saving me." James smiled for the first time in what felt like ages. It wasn't a big, flashy smile, but it was real. In that moment, he didn't feel like the invisible man sitting on the bench, the man everyone avoided. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had done something that mattered. "Don't worry about it, kid," James said, his voice warm but quiet. "You're safe now." Liam stood next to James, still wiping the last of his tears from his cheeks. His small body trembled from the fear that had gripped him moments before. But now, with the bullies gone and James by his side, a sense of safety was beginning to settle in. He glanced up at James, eyes wide with admiration. James glanced down and noticed for the first time the fine clothes Liam was wearing. His shoes were spotless, and his shirt looked like something from an expensive store. The backpack slung over Liam's shoulder was neat and sturdy, the kind that cost more than James made in months back when he still had a job. James couldn't help but wonder who Liam's parents were. Someone was clearly taking good care of this boy, but why hadn't they come to his aid? What was a kid like Liam doing here, alone and vulnerable, in the park? James didn't ask, though. He didn't want to pry, and Liam didn't seem eager to talk about it. Instead, James simply said, "You okay now?" Liam nodded, though he still looked shaken. "Yeah, I'm okay. Because of you." He paused, then added, "I wish I had someone like you around all the time." The words hit James like a wave, catching him off guard. Someone like me. The thought echoed in his mind. It seemed impossible that this boy, this child who clearly had more than James ever could, would wish for someone like him to be around. After all, James was just James, a homeless man with no family, no job, no future. But the way Liam said it, so honestly, made James believe, if only for a moment, that maybe he did have something to offer. James smiled gently. "I'm sure you've got someone who looks out for you," he said, trying to downplay the boy's compliment. "You're not alone, kid." Liam shrugged, looking down at the ground, as if thinking about something sad. "Sometimes it feels like I am," he said quietly. James felt a pang of sympathy for the boy. He understood that feeling all too well. "Well, you're not alone today," James said, trying to sound comforting. Liam looked up at him with wide eyes, a spark of hope flickering in them. "Do you really mean that?" James nodded. "Yeah, I do." They stood there for a little while longer, talking quietly. James asked about school, and Liam told him about his favorite teacher. They talked about little things, things that made James forget, for just a moment, that he was a homeless man. With Liam, he felt almost normal, like he was more than just a shadow on the sidewalk. And as they talked, James couldn't shake the odd feeling that he was meant to meet this boy. There was something about Liam that felt familiar, like their paths had crossed for a reason. James didn't know why, but there was a connection there, a bond that felt deeper than just the events of that afternoon. As the conversation slowed, James found himself wondering what Liam's life was like. Who took care of him? Did he have a family that loved him? Or was there more to the story? Liam didn't say much about his home life, and James didn't push. But there was something in the boy's eyes, a kind of loneliness that reminded James of himself. Eventually, Liam looked up at James with a shy smile. "You're my hero, you know." James blinked, taken aback. "I'm not a hero, kid. I'm just me." But Liam shook his head, smiling even wider. "No, you're a hero to me." James couldn't help but smile back. He had never thought of himself as a hero, but maybe he was. But then, the sound of tires crunching on gravel made both of them look up. A sleek black car rolled to a stop at the edge of the park. The kind of car James hadn't been near in years. Its polished surface gleamed in the sunlight, and as the door opened, a tall man in a sharp suit stepped out, his face set in a mixture of worry and anger. "Dad," Liam called, jumping up from the bench. James stayed seated, his eyes fixed on the man as he approached. The closer he got, the tighter James's chest became. There was something familiar about the man's face, the sharp lines of his jaw, the cold, commanding look in his eyes, and then it hit James like a punch to the gut. It was him. Mr. Carter, the man who had ruined his life. Years ago, James had trusted Mr. Carter, worked for him, even called him a friend. They had worked together at a company where James held a stable job, a job he loved. But behind James's back, Mr. Carter had betrayed him, tricking him into signing away his rights and his savings. Overnight, James lost everything: his job, his home, his stability. And before James could even fight back, Mr. Carter had moved on, leaving James to fall through the cracks of society. James's stomach twisted as the memories came flooding back, each one more painful than the last. He had spent years trying to forget the face of the man who had destroyed him. But now that face was standing right in front of him, the father of the boy he had just saved. "Liam," Mr. Carter said, his voice tight. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Liam ran to his father's side, but Mr. Carter's eyes flickered to James, and for a split second, his expression changed. From worry to recognition. His face went pale, and James saw the moment when Mr. Carter realized who he was looking at. They locked eyes, and in that moment, James felt a surge of anger so strong he almost couldn't breathe. This was the man who had taken everything from him, the man who had sent him spiraling into a life of homelessness. And now, here he was, rich, powerful, and still in control. But Mr. Carter quickly masked his shock. He straightened his shoulders, pretending not to recognize James, his face turning cold and businesslike. "Thank you," he said stiffly, looking at James with a distant, formal politeness. "I see you've been keeping Liam company." James couldn't speak. His throat felt tight, and his hands curled into fists at his sides. The betrayal, the hurt, and the anger swirled inside him, but he couldn't move, couldn't say anything. He was frozen, trapped in the memory of the day everything had fallen apart. Liam, sensing the tension, looked between his father and James. "Dad, this is the man who saved me. Those kids were being mean to me, and he made them go away." Mr. Carter's eyes flicked back to James, and there was a moment, a brief, fleeting moment, where James saw guilt in them. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the same cold indifference. "Is that so?" Mr. Carter said, his voice flat. "Well, I suppose we owe you thanks, then." James clenched his jaw, feeling the surge of bitterness rise in his chest. Thanks. That was all he got. After everything this man had done to him, After all the pain and loss, Mr. Carter thought a simple thank you was enough. But James said nothing. He couldn't. The weight of the past, the years of struggle, all hung over him like a dark cloud. He wanted to yell, to scream at Mr. Carter for the life he had taken from him. But looking at Liam, who still stood there, so innocent and unaware, James couldn't bring himself to say anything. "Thank you," Mr. Carter repeated, his voice measured and formal. "We appreciate what you did for Liam." James's throat tightened. This man had taken everything from him, had sent his life spiraling into a nightmare of homelessness and despair. Part of James wanted to confront him, to demand justice for all he had lost. But as he looked back at Liam, standing beside his father with such innocent admiration, James made his choice. He took a deep breath, feeling the tension in his chest release just a little. He wouldn't do it. He wouldn't hurt Liam just to settle his own scores. "It's nothing," James said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm just glad he's safe." Mr. Carter blinked, clearly surprised, but he quickly recovered, nodding stiffly. He seemed relieved that James hadn't brought up their past, hadn't caused a scene in front of his son. Liam, completely unaware of the unspoken tension, smiled brightly at James. James smiled, though it was bittersweet. He wasn't sure if he was the best, but in that moment, he knew he had made the right choice. He had protected Liam, not just from the bullies, but from a painful truth that the boy didn't need to know. It wasn't about letting Mr. Carter off the hook. It was about doing what was best for Liam. As Mr. Carter and Liam turned to leave, James stood still, watching them walk toward the shiny black car. His heart was heavy, but there was also a sense of peace. He had chosen kindness over revenge, not for Mr. Carter's sake, but for the sake of the boy who still saw him as a hero. Liam waved one last time before getting into the car, and James waved back, his heart full of conflicting emotions. The car pulled away, disappearing down the road, leaving James standing alone in the park once again. He had faced the man who had ruined him, and though he hadn't gotten his revenge, James knew that in some way, he had won. He had chosen to be the better person, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As the car pulled farther away, James noticed Liam's small hand pressed against the back window, waving furiously. James smiled and waved back, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Liam's words echoed in his mind. "You're my hero." For the first time in a long time, James believed it. He had been a hero in the way that mattered most, not through strength, but through compassion. He may have lost his home, his job, and the life he once knew, but in that moment, he had gained something far more valuable. A sense of peace and the understanding that real power came from the choices he made in the face of adversity. James walked slowly back to his park bench, the familiar spot where he had spent so many lonely days. But today, it felt different. He felt different. He sat down, the tension in his body easing, and closed his eyes for a moment. He was still homeless, still forgotten by most of the world. But now, as the breeze whispered through the trees and Liam's wave lingered in his mind, James felt a victory that was his alone. A victory that came not from revenge, but from the quiet, powerful act of forgiveness. And in that, James knew he had found his true strength.